New questions are arising about what exactly Luigi Mangione's mother knew about her son before his arrest in the UnitedHealthcare killing out in New York. A statement from a recent press conference made our ears perk up as we look into this and we bring on former homicide prosecutor Matt Murphy to break it all down. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Hey, so before we jump into this further, I have an exciting announcement for you guys. The video version of Sidebar is now available on Spotify. That's right, and we are so thankful for your guys' support of Sidebar. Us getting this show on Spotify video is truly due to how loyal this audience is. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And yes, you can now watch and listen on the go, from Diddy to the UnitedHealthcare murder updates to crazy court moments. It's all on Spotify. So right now you can scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the description to follow Sidebar on Spotify. There are just more and more developments in this UnitedHealthcare CEO shooting that we want to talk about. Aside from the fact that extradition just happened like 5 minutes ago, I'll explain what he decided to do, but the latest that we haven't really talked about is what's being reported, including from the USA Today, that the mother of the suspected shooter, Luigi Mangione, allegedly told authorities before Mangione was arrested that this shooting might be something that she could see him doing. Process that for a second. So we know Mangione is accused of shooting to death Brian Thompson back on December 4th in Midtown Manhattan as the health insurance executive was on his way to the company's annual investor conference. And we know that after a 5-day manhunt, Mangione was apprehended in Altoona, Pennsylvania in a McDonald's after he was identified based on these surveillance photos from New York that was circulated around the country by authorities. And we also know that he's just been indicted on 11 counts in New York, including 3 counts of murder. 2 of those, including first-degree murder, which carries a sentence of life in prison, are murders committed in furtherance of terrorism. Very, very aggressive, and we can talk a little bit more about that. And I'll be curious to see if prosecutors will be able to prove it. But he was also hit with weapon possession and forgery charges out in Pennsylvania. And that was really interesting because it became a question, would he stay there, fight the charges? There's going to be a preliminary hearing, but also, will he have to be extradited back to New York? Again, we'll talk about that. But now I have to get to this issue of his mother. And I will tell you, I think that this is really, really interesting. So there had been reports that Mangione's mother had filed a missing persons report for her son back on November 18th. And according to CNN, a law enforcement official indicated that she hadn't spoken to her son since July. So, how did it come to be that she allegedly indicated her son might be capable of doing something like this? Well, NYPD Chief of Detectives Joseph Kenney was asked about this at a news conference the other day when the indictment of Mangione was announced. Listen to what he had to say.
So the original missing report took place back in November 18th in San Francisco. The sergeant that was involved in that case reached out to the San Francisco field office and said, hey, basically, I'm working on a missing case. I saw the photograph that was distributed by the NYPD. There bears a resemblance. That tip was forwarded to us close to 45 hours after the incident took place. It showed up to a TFO, which is a task force officer. We have NYPD officers embedded with the FBI. They received that tip. It was one of 4 tips that they had received that day, and they were vetting it. Part of that vetting process was that they reached out to Mangione's mother in San Francisco very late on the 7th. They had a conversation where she didn't indicate that it was her son in the photograph, but she said it might be something that she could see him doing. So that information was going to be passed along to the detectives the next morning, but fortunately we apprehended him before that we could act on that.
So why would that be the case, right? If she really said that, why? And remember, a friend of Mangione, Aaron Cranston, revealed to the New York Times that he received a message indicating that Mangione's family was looking for him. We know there was reporting that Mangione was becoming more and more isolated, potentially more extreme online. He had this online activity, seemed to reveal these odd ideological leanings. Particularly, I've cited this before, this Goodreads review from earlier this year of the manifesto of the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, in which Mangione apparently gave the book a 4-star rating. Now, Mangione's cousin, Nino Mangione, issued a statement on behalf of the family and made it clear that they didn't know anything prior to the news of his arrest. It said, "We cannot comment on news reports regarding Luigi Mangione. We only know what we have read in the media. Our family is shocked and devastated by Luigi's arrest. We offer our prayers to the family of Brian Thompson, and we ask people to pray for all involved." but I got to get some perspective on this. So let me bring back on friend of the show, former homicide prosecutor Matt Murphy. Matt, good to see you. Thanks so much for coming on. So before we even get into the mother, like 5 minutes before we came on, we found out that Luigi Mangione in Pennsylvania has waived his extradition, which means now he is going to be transported immediately back to New York. You surprised?
No, I'm not surprised. This is something you see all the time in murder cases, where somebody will either flee to another state or they'll be in from another state when they commit the murder, and extraditing somebody from another state in America is actually really easy to do. They're entitled to process, but you're going to get them 100% of the time. So his lawyers, he's got a very capable defense team here. They knew that, and they made the decision to just get this case up to New York, where it's ultimately going to be no matter what.
Like, don't waste the time and the resources of trying to fight this, like the legal expense of fighting it. You know, you're going to lose. You're going to lose extradition.
You're going to lose extradition.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so now I want to talk about this issue with the mother, because what do you make of that statement?
Well, I think that, number one, it's important for everybody to remember that the family here is not at fault. Okay, the family was cooperative with law enforcement. The family also, I read some things that they'd actually submitted a missing persons report with San Francisco when they were trying to find him towards the end of the summer. So I think that this is one of those things that they've probably just heard one too many rants. And when the mother said she could see her son doing that, that's obviously very significant from an investigative perspective. But the question is, do they need that at this point? And I think based on this evidence, the answer to that is no. You get a 3-page manifesto that is a statement of intent that's already in there. Right? You know, I think that Alvin Bragg won't be prosecuting this case himself. I think that whoever he has is going to be capable, and this will be the type of thing that I don't think we're going to see too many family members on the stand.
Do you think, though, they're being interviewed?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, the family has already been interviewed.
For what information? What do you think?
For motive, for plans, for schemes. Who else might he have been mad at? Are there any other murders? They're going to cross every T and dot every I in this investigation, and that's going to include interviewing the family, who, based on everything that I've reviewed, appears to be totally cooperative and doing everything right.
And I know when she was speaking, we mentioned this, when she was speaking to law enforcement, she couldn't official, like 100% confirm that that was her son. And by the way, I think there's going to be maybe a separate argument. You look at the surveillance photos, some people look and be like, yeah, it looks like him. And there's others like, no, I'm not entirely sure. So I think that's kind of understandable. But then again, it was those photos what led to his identification as arrest in Altoona, Pennsylvania. I thought that was significant that it was reported that that happened. Look, I hate to ask this question, but I have to ask this question. We live in a day and age where separate scenarios, but when we deal with school shootings, right, these are people who are underage. You ask, what did the parents know? Was it foreseeable? Should they be held liable? Obviously, he's an adult male. But if there was evidence, and again, there is no evidence to suggest this whatsoever, but that statement just made me wonder, if there was evidence that they knew he maybe was capable of something, maybe they didn't know that he was going to do something like this, they couldn't be held liable, right? They couldn't be held liable on a civil side or even a criminal side?
Well, on the criminal side, they certainly couldn't. There's no obligation in any state to take affirmative action to prevent a crime, okay? If they help in some way, or if they facilitate, aid, abet, or encourage, that's a different story than they could, but we have no evidence of that. And based on everything that I've read about the family, everything that they've said publicly or the representatives have, I doubt there's going to be anything along those lines that we're going to see. I think this is a young guy who got his head twisted up onto this, and he had this zeal against corporate America and the healthcare specifically. One of the interesting things, Jesse, that I think in that manifesto is he said these parasites, plural.
Yes.
And you know, I've seen some crazy conspiracy stuff online, which, by the way, it's like, this is what happens in murder cases. I've had murder cases where there's been backpacks with a cornucopia of evidence like we see in this. So this really is the way these things work a lot of times. If they plan it out, they get very good at figuring out how to get away from the murder scene and not so good about getting away with the murder, because this appears to be his first crime. But you know, parasites, plural, is interesting, and that may go a long way to explain why he still had this weapon, why he still had this fake IDs, and why they hadn't caught him yet.
You mean targeting potentially other?
Very well might be. And one of the things that everybody's been talking about in this case that I think is very interesting is the reaction on social media.
Sure.
He's a handsome young guy, and we see people saying, you know, violence is bad, but we've seen officials like Elizabeth Warren came out and said something like that. Bernie Sanders said something like that. This professor at Penn said she was proud to be a University of Penn professor because of what he did. And look, murder is murder. There's no murder's bad, but, you know, that's like a domestic violence case where some man kills his wife. You know, we don't in the courtroom engage in a big, well, what did she do to deserve it? Did she say something like, was she cheating on him? Like, that's not what it's about. It's murder is murder, murder is bad, and this whole thing where people are trying to take advantage of it and is exactly the purpose of terrorism. In the state of New York, it's about trying to influence public policy.
I was going to ask you about that. Look, I've been screaming on the rooftops that I think it's insane that people are praising this, or seemingly supporting it. But let me ask you this: the terrorism charges, right? Some would say, you know, I get that, right? You know, if it's done to send a message, if it's done to change policy, if it's done to, you know, it's done in the middle of the streets of New York City, it was done to terrorize. So this is the language, what you would need to trigger the terrorism component. The defendant, with intent to cause the death of another person, caused the death of Brian Thompson, and said person was killed in furtherance of an act of terrorism involving a violent act and acts dangerous to human life that were in violation of the criminal laws of this state and were intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, influence the policies of a unit of government by intimidation or coercion, and affect the conduct of a unit of government by murder, assassination, or kidnapping. How does it fit here?
Well, I think it fits broadly. The DA's office is going to argue that this is an attempt to influence public policy. This is an attempt to influence government policy towards healthcare and or the healthcare corporations themselves. So that's where the argument's going to come from, that this man was murdered because of the way healthcare operates in the United States, and this is an attempt to influence public policy. That's going to be the argument that's coming their way.
Would it be a successful argument?
It's an interesting thing, right? Because what the defense is going to argue here is they're going to say, yeah, he hated him because of that, but he wasn't actually trying to take that additional step and impact policy. Now, I've only seen part of the manifesto. Can
I read you a few?
Yeah.
Can I read you a few statements?
Yeah.
And so keep that in mind. I'm just going to read you a few statements from so it was not only the manifesto, but it was also this notebook that was found as well. To the feds, I'll keep this short because I do respect what you do for our country. To save you a lengthy investigation, I state plainly that I wasn't working with anyone. I do apologize for any strife of traumas, but it had to be done. Frankly, these parasites simply had it coming. And regarding UnitedHealthcare, the writer talked about how it's grown and grown, but has our life expectancy? No, the reality is these have simply gotten too powerful and they continue to abuse our country for immense profit. And according to CNN and ABC, there was also a passage about not using a bomb because that would kill too many innocents and how the shooting would be more targeted. And also there was a statement, what do? You whack the CEO at the annual parasitic bean counter convention. By the way, that goes into the idea of knowing where the target was going to be. But those writings, do you think, A, will be used to support this terrorism charge, and is it enough?
Well, the manifesto in its entirety is certainly going to come into evidence. And it's a statement of intent, also known as motive, right? So absolutely they're going to be used. Whether it's enough, we'll see. If I was prosecuting this case, I would absolutely have charged first-degree murder, and I would absolutely go forward with this terrorism count. And, you know, the people that you see the impact of it, because now it is impacting.
Does that come into evidence, the reaction, the public reaction? Because you don't know if, like, did he expect that? Did he expect to be a folk hero?
I think he wanted to be a folk hero. I think that he is over the moon right now, that so many people are coming in supporting him because it shows that he has had the exact impact that he wants. Probably we're not going to see the social media response introduced against him. Where that's going to come out is during the selection of the jury, there are going to be questionnaires, and they're going to have to weed out people that are sympathetic to this. Yeah. And that's where it's going to come in. That's where everybody's going to become aware of it.
I get why they went first degree. The reason in New York it wasn't just automatic to charge first degree murders because New York is very specific. It's not just premeditated murder. It's specific categories in order for first degree to actually be triggered. That's why you see a lot of cases, you're like, why is that second degree? It's because that's really the only way it fits. First degree, yes, there's terrorism. Other times it's if you kill a police officer. I think it's killings that are done maybe, I think, in a prison, things like that.
Which is a great point. And as lawyers and people who watch the Law&Crime Network, I think they can appreciate it. In California, first degree murder is any murder committed with premeditation, deliberation, or any of these special circumstances would make it, like a murder committed during a rape, a kidnapping, a child molest, a bank robbery. All of those could make it felony murder or first-degree murder. Here, a first-degree murder is essentially what we would call a special circ murder in California. It's murder committed of a judge, murder committed of a police officer,
right.
in a prison, like you said. And on that list, there is terrorism. And terrorism is defined by, like, what you already quoted, you know.
I want to go back to, and this where we talk about with the mother, right? So we've talked about the writings. We've talked about things that are online. We've talked about the crime. For her to allegedly make a statement that she thinks this is something he might be capable of, I'm paraphrasing, it would seem to suggest that she knew some of this. And the question becomes, how did she know this? When did she know this? I think these are fair questions. That press conference, it stood out to me. It stood out to a lot of people. I think that's why you're seeing so many articles about this mother's statement. Do you think we'll get those answers, and will they be explored at a trial?
Well, I think the police will certainly get those answers. Whether that's ever made public or whether it's ever admitted in a trial really it's a second question. I think if they get something really good, they would probably want to introduce that. I mean, imagine how many rants this family has had to listen to. And it's speculative by us at this point. Of course, he's presumed innocent, but imagine this guy last Thanksgiving, you know, sitting around the table talking about his political beliefs. You know, we all have some friend that's out there on the far left or the far right that rants and rants and rants, and then all of a sudden, if you see somebody that looks like them consistent with one of those rants, you could see a statement like the mom saying, hey, look, I'm shocked, the family's devastated, but I could see him doing something like that. I mean, I think that's the context we're talking about.
And one other thing I'll say about the family, and I don't know the family at all, but just putting a realistic component, the law enforcement's reaching out to you about a suspected shooter that murdered a health insurance CEO. You might be so frantic, you don't even know what you're saying. I think that's fair too. Like, you know, you're being confronted with the idea that your son might be now the most wanted man in the United States. I have to also color a little bit with what she said with that. I think we have to be careful of just taking everything at a face value.
There's no doubt. And also, look, this is a guy who apparently went off the rails. He stopped communicating with his friends and family several months ago. So she's been worried. The family made that missing persons report in San Francisco. So they've probably been increasingly concerned about his mental health, the direction that he's been moving in. And so, look, my heart kind of goes out to them a little bit. You know, this is devastating for them. But I have to say, for 17 years in the homicide unit, I spent a lot of time dealing with victims of murder. And the first thing I would do after filing charges always was sit down with the family and kind of introduce my team and let them know that there were people that actually cared. What this man's family is going through, the victim in this case,
Brian Thompson,
is absolutely the worst thing a family can experience. And for all of those like Elizabeth Warren or like that Penn professor who want to use this as a way of advancing their own political agenda, look, they're condoning murder. When you start talking about, well, murder's bad or violence is bad, but what this family is going through is the worst of the worst. And I think everybody needs to take a deep breath before they look at a guy who looks handsome and says, oh, I'd acquit him if I was on the jury. No, you wouldn't, actually. If you follow the law, you wouldn't do that. Or any rational, decent human being would not do that.
And it's a conflating of an anger towards the health insurance industry, but saying this is somehow understandable, this is somehow justified. And I think that's really dangerous, not only for this, but also where does it end?
Well,
right?
that's exactly right.
Who's
next on the list?
Yeah.
And if we could get a list from those people, maybe they would just be the ones that have to increase their security, and you and I wouldn't have to pay so much more for our health care, because that's the great irony, right? Yeah. I mean, I pay for my own health care, and it's expensive, and I just know it's going to go up because now the CEO of my healthcare company is going to get 24-hour security because of this. So the ironic upshot is healthcare is about to get more expensive. It's vastly complex. The person who hadn't had it figured out, I guarantee, is Luigi Mangione or this Penn professor. You know, it's vastly complex, and you're exactly right. Like, we can't mitigate murder, especially cold-blooded, planned murder like this, because the person had a reason. The person who commits murder always has a reason to do it. Yeah. They always, 100% of the time, there's a reason to kill another human being. But if it's a good reason, we don't call it murder anymore. You call it self-defense. You call it maybe a manslaughter. Right. There is no path to mitigate this case into a manslaughter. There's no way to get there. They may argue mental illness. I'm sure they will. But you know, when you start doing that, it is such a slippery slope. And how many other people are on that list? Because everybody has a reason when they commit a murder. And it's like, well, what did the wife do? Well, was the neighbor really obnoxious when he was playing his music too loud at the party? You can't do that. Murder is murder, wrong is wrong, and factors in mitigation is something that gets considered by a jury under some circumstances, or a judge. You know, and I don't see it here.
By the way, just to give a second perspective on this before we wrap it up, we did a whole episode yesterday on Sidebar about Brian Thompson, and people might not realize this, but portraying him as the villain of the story is not only inappropriate, but it's inaccurate. If you look at the way what he was trying to do before his death about changing the perspective on UnitedHealthcare and the views of health insurance, I think it's something I encourage everybody to check out. Look, I don't know him fully. UnitedHealthcare had a ton of problems because we actually did an episode on that as well, like in that all the problems that were facing UnitedHealthcare. But that is just encourage everybody to just think back to the fact that he was a human being, he was a father, he was a son, he was a brother. And by the way, whatever misgivings people had about him or the healthcare industry, the death penalty is not on the table for it. So it's really just upsetting.
Yeah, it's not a part of the discussion. By the way, I will debate anybody, anytime, anywhere about this murder and whether this was okay.
Yeah, maybe we'll have you do that. Matt Murphy, thanks so much. Appreciate
so happy to be in.
Thank you. All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.